Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's research seminar. It's a very great pleasure and honor for me to welcome Waltraud Schelkle. She's Joint Chair for European Public Policy at the Department for Political and Social Sciences and the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute of Fiesole. Before, she was Professor of Political Economy at the London School of Economics. And her research interests are, first of all, in the area of political economy of monetary integration, understood as a form of interstate risk sharing. And she published a book in 2017 on the political economy of monetary solidarity, understanding the experiment of the euro. And this work has been continued in an ERC-funded research project on policy crisis and crisis politics, sovereignty, solidarity, and identity in Europe post-2008. And I'm very, very interested in what you will present from this current research. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margit, for inviting me. Thank you for coming to a presentation that is really more political economy than economics as you might expect it and as your own work is. But I am a fully trained economist. I have two PhDs, or doctorates, I should say, in economics, and have only late in my life learned to become a political economist. And in this project recently, because I wrote this book that Margit was talking about, Political Economy of Monetary Solidarity, Understanding the Experiment of the Euro, it was really trying to understand how did the Euro crisis not go completely out of hand and lead to a massive crisis? And my answer was, in short, institutions under this stress test, from a payments mechanism like Target to the ECB, but also simply the collateral rules that the ECB had for open market operations. These are institutions that can, under stress, provide solidarity, risk sharing in a very diverse monetary union, and had often, especially particularly the cross-border payments mechanism Target, had insurance capacities of which we didn't even know. The problem with that kind of solidarity, which is a solidarity of action and not of the word, because many people would, in political science, we don't even call that solidarity. They see a certain element of altruism and intentional willingness to help and empathy as part of solidarity. I took it between governments, don't expect that kind of solidarity. If it's solidarity that we take risks from each other and carry them together with great enthusiasm or not, that is solidarity. But this solidarity was one of by stealth. It's a byproduct of other things that these institutions were meant to do. And the problem with that was, which we saw in particular with the Troika programs, is it does nothing for political integration, for, say, Greek people seeing that when they were attacked by markets, and if we had left Greece to its own devices, I mean, the pensions would have had to be written down, or Italy for that matter, that they would have had an age poverty problem beyond everything we have seen so far. But that's the counterfactual that nobody sees. And then the Troika programs were so harshly formulated with this conditionality that it had never politically unifying role. In fact, the EU came out of the euro area crisis deeply divided. And this is the starting point for this whole project. How did the EU, in a way, survive a number of crises? Going forward, I had this found recently when I gave this paper actually internally as a first attempt in Fiesole at the European University Institute. I found this, I had just at the weekend this opinion piece by Jaran Ganesh, who is a very original mind, a very libertarian thinker, but still interesting. And he basically has this thing, the right is now interested in a United States of Europe. How is that possible? And he has here is it the Bulgarian or a Belgian ticket inspectors, that the EU was for a long time seen as a kind of Belgian ticket inspector of whether everybody in the bus of the European bus has paid its tickets, has made its done what the rules require. And the far right is now one that wants another Europe, wants a Europe of Christian nation states and all that. And he says, what has happened to them once they were Eurosceptics? And he himself says, I don't cheer this stuff on. My Europe is the technocratic one of Mario Draghi's speeches and court rulings against anti-competitive practices. So the good old Europe that only certain elites like. But my discomfort is precisely the point. There is no longer only a liberal case for a unified continent, but one that is more about strength in numbers against external predators and so on. And what the point of this piece, this little op-ed, is really, it seems that we have moved on from debating whether we want a European Union or not, and what policies it should do, what regulations should be moved up the hierarchy, to arguing over what kind of EU polity we want. And this is our point. The research questions are more or less generalized what I had already in this book, although I should really say Hans-Peter Grüsi and Maurizio Ferreira were extremely respectable scholars and way more respectable than I am. And it was a synergy project in the true sense of the word. So what makes the European Union so susceptible to crisis? Why did we have, when we came out of a financial crisis that actually originated in the US, why did it drag on in this way in Europe? And how did the EU survive a series of crises, each one of them severe and often unprecedented? And our answers was that we went back, and that's really what the two had started out there, both known Stein-Rokkan scholars, a political historian who has basically studied the history of European state formation over 500 years. And goes back to that, we go back to that theory of European state building. There are some authors that are relevant, you may not know, and say the EU is a compound polity in the sense of it takes from other forms, the unitary nation state, confederations, the loosest form, and federations, has elements and combines them in its own form. It is a political form in its own right. And it is it in exactly that sense. Every polity has boundaries, has some binding authority, and over time, through the domestic political structuring, the internal structuring of that polity, you develop systems of loyalty. That is the welfare state in particular, but also voting, political participation. And Rokkan has to be seen as a theory in contrast to Charles Tilly, who has this bellicist theory. So in a way, and I'm saying this because you may come to it in the discussion, Tilly's theory was one: war makes states and states make war. You need kind of an outside enemy. Then you start to put up a standing army, and you need a tax system to finance that army, etc., etc. This is a theory that says, well, it comes from rulers who want to consolidate a territory and then are very focused on internal polity building rather than always this outside orientation. We say the EU is particular, and it is in its origin, that it has flexible and not hard boundaries, that it needs to, as such, to defend. In fact, it has used this continuously and does today with the Ukraine, used it as a foreign policy instrument. It has very dispersed authority, not at least formally clearly allocated as in a federation. And it has only second-order loyalty. The citizens have only second-order loyalty at best to that polity, because the first-order loyalty is with the domestic welfare democracy. And this configuration makes the EU susceptible to crisis. So that's the answer to the first question. It can lead to what they call political destructuring. For example, that decision-making of your parliament is so uploaded to the EU level that you don't see anymore what were the decisions we actually made. How were we represented in Brussels? Without the EU then building these structures at the EU level and have very transparent processes in which decision-making happens. And this is the fear that people like Fritz Scharf and, so to speak, sympathetic people with the European integration process, but increasingly critical. Wolfgang Streeck is a less sympathetic critic of this. So, to the second question, how did the EU crisis-prone polity get through this crisis? And I will not talk about every crisis. You can come back to me in the Q&A. But I take Brexit, and that is in a way that was the GAU, the größte unternehmende Unfall in a situation for integration fields. Right? We never had a disintegration. We thought it is a one-way street. Who's in, stays in. And there happens, and it's not any old little state. It's the United Kingdom, which was a motor behind the single market. It was a net contributor to the budget. So this is a worst-case scenario for our integration theories of European integration. Hence the title From European Integration to EU Polity Formation in our book. So let me briefly tell you how in this situation these weaknesses of the polity configuration that the EU's compound polity, it characterizes the EU compound polity, how it managed to use them to actually come to something that was in the end not a crisis. In 2015-16, we have three crises that culminate. The refugee crisis, the euro area crisis, again with the third bailout program for Greece, and then that referendum that goes wrong, as nobody had thought. Article 50, a leftover, interestingly, that also the UK had put in and then was left in order to assure the new member states from the East that we are not a Soviet Union. Funnily enough, the Soviet constitution actually had such an Article 50 in it, but we know how it handled this, so that they could always go out if they wanted. That we are not forcing anybody to stay in that European Union. And leaves the initiative to the secessionist state, right? They have to activate it. And after 2 years, when they want to go out, they have 2 years then to negotiate. And that led to a fear of the domino effect. Maurizio Ferreira said, this is such an oddity. I do not know this from democratic federations, that you have something like the secessionist state can say, I want to go out. And later did a paper with our postdocs, and they reconstructed it, and we could see that this was actually, funnily enough, in its favor. So the first thing was that the second order loyalty of EU citizens left the EU a pretty free hand in doing this. And there was not that certain governments had to pay attention at home, what they could let this task force do and negotiate in the name of the council. Except for Ireland, and at some point because of Gibraltar, Spain, no national audience was ever interested in this whole Brexit process. We did a survey on this. The dispersed authority was actually strategically used. You had this task force under Barnaby, recruited from the absolute elite of this elite bureaucracy, extremely capable bureaucrats who were supposedly just at the long arm, totally under the curatelle of the council. The council, the only authority that these Eurosceptic Brits ever accepted, right? These are the collective of member states, the governments. It's not the commission who tells you or negotiates that. There you have a special task force, and they get their instruction from the remaining 27. But of course, this task force came back and each time briefed the council what the negotiation issue is and what mandate they would need in order to confront the British deal, and said, this is what our instructions, we cannot move from that. And so each time the British negotiation team met a wall, and with the authority, the legitimation of 27 governments. The parliament, if necessary, played the bad cop and said we would veto anything that is a concession, overly friendly to the Brits. In the wrong place. And then the flexible boundaries. If you think of the negotiation that we had in the end, this with the Northern Irish Protocol and all that. So because there is the peace treaty on no border on the island of Ireland, the EU had the moral high ground in saying, we will not allow this international treaty that you signed being undone by your Brexit. So what ended was a hard Brexit that let only Great Britain go out, not the UK. If you think of the equivalent, if we had hard borders, that would require the annexation of part of a state. While this was one which in the end Boris Johnson voluntarily subscribed to. So you can see, because the EU has these very flexible integration boundaries, it could make a deal that was totally in its favor and totally a first big concession that Britain has to make, and is a continuous source of grievances for these Eurosceptics. So from the EU's point of view, Brexit was the crisis that didn't happen against all predictions. I mean, we reconstructed for a special issue in Western European politics the extremely pessimistic predictions that were made at the time. And as far as we are concerned, the EU did not have a crisis. This was a crisis that we didn't have to research as such. There is a rule of law crisis as the follow-on. That's not. Now, is this generalizable, or was this just the lucky draw? We tried to argue, I must say, I tried to argue very strongly. An interesting explanation would always, if you can show that in moments of extreme stress, you can turn the weaknesses into strength. Otherwise, you have a list of reasons why this time it went not so bad after all, or whatever. It is more interesting to say that this polity has actually capacities to maintain itself, and that makes it a polity. That it is not each time just a long summit in which some member states in an international organization make a deal. And the COVID-19 pandemic was another case of the strength of a weak center. In fact, this is where we first thought about this. And we compared it with the United States, basically the total counter polity, where we have a huge, especially in such situations, a huge concentration of powers, fiscal capacities and everything, authority, legitimation at the top level. None of that you had, especially not in the health policy domain in the EU, and the fiscal weakness of the EU is something we will talk about later. What you had there, and it is not only under Trump 1, that would have been weak to say, because you can, at that time, we could still see him as an aberration that it will go away. Unfortunately, it has not gone away. And Biden did exactly the opposite. And the Republican states opposed every step. And our explanation for why it went well for the EU in COVID is the absence of political rivalry, part of this lack of loyalty of first order loyalty to the EU, because our political participation rights are really quite, indirect, shall we say. This European Parliament where we hardly know the people we should vote for. In the US, there was a rivalry of who hands out the medical equipment and so on, to the point of where the states used, and Republican plus Democratic states disused Air Force plants in order to receive deliveries of medical equipment, because they had made experience, if anything was announced officially, the Trump administration seized it and then handed out with the big Trump signature on it. Because each one wanted to have also this recognition for who is helping. They had an agreed division of labor, of responsibilities that you could also clearly show. And that is not because from the start we were holding hands and said we're sitting in one boat. No, we had a real bad start with Italy triggering the crisis mechanism that should have made every member state to come to the rescue of the country. Instead, they suddenly realized what a big problem this is going to be and looked at there and had export controls, famously Germany. While China and Cuba at the time sent some masks, etc. The EU at the same time was helping China, but could not, had in this case needed a different mechanism. The response therefore provided the EU with a chance to exercise ostentatious solidarity with these alienated southern member states. That was the legacy of the euro area crisis. And we have a preemptive bailout facility similar to this European Stability Mechanism, and finance for reforms for a recovery that was extremely uncertain what would happen. And of course, one didn't want to have another of these doom loops evolving in government bond markets. However, we did accept that, institutions don't do that as such. You have to find these markets, sometimes in case of target, but in these cases, you had to find the political will to mobilize these capacities and make the case for it. And this is in each serious cases where the EU was so politicized that the EU itself was put into question. And one of the examples is Draghi's speech, but then also these speeches and interviews in the countries of your opposition during COVID. It is an own mode of policy making, polity maintenance. That doesn't just make the case for a particular policy, which is the normal bread and butter thing in a union of democracies, but where you make the case of why we are in the EU. And extraordinary interventions by political and policy elites that kept the EU together and even strengthened its policy architecture when its very existence was at stake. And we needed that repeatedly. I just mentioned Brexit, the flexible boundaries that made bounding viable, pandemic, but not in the refugee crisis, somewhat of a puzzle, that you have this dispersed authority that can be constructed such that it could also disperse blame. If it had gone wrong, you would have the Barnier Commission as a bit of a fall guy, while the council could have said, or the council, if then the commission would be so impossible, some in the commission could say, in the council, we were the responsible and we took these decisions. It's flexible. You cannot quite locate where the blame is to locate. And then the pandemic itself, the rhetorical action around this, Merkel went out to say this is an issue beyond the numbers. There must be a strong signal that we are united. And she said this, of course, with a view to Trump America. In the euro area crisis to the pandemic, we had suddenly, while one always says politicization is bad for European integration, then they don't want to go out, then they don't want to make the case because the populists are out there and can turn everything around. In this case, you could see that member state governments went out, and I would in particular say not only Macron and Merkel as usual, it was Sanchez and Conte who also made the case very, very strongly that this time must be different. Otherwise, this Europe cannot survive if you leave people with just stigmatizing bailouts in such situations. Just to be clear, this is not a happy story. It will always work. Such interventions are not guaranteed to work. It didn't work during the euro area crisis. The refugee crisis is an ongoing risky business, and the rule of law crisis we see as an outcome of this membership crisis that was Brexit, that some understood, oh, inside we are much better. Instead of triggering recession, Article 50, we stay inside. Nobody can throw us out. And we have a seat at the table. For smaller countries, of course, more important than perhaps for Britain. However, and you probably think that, it may all be very well that you can use weaknesses into strength, but isn't the lack of central fiscal capacity an irredeemable weakness that you cannot possibly turn into a strength in crisis? And I would say no. And I really see this as the alternative to a central budget. So a fiscal federation has some central budget, to varying degrees how strong, and its principle is co-insurance. Whenever something happens, you top up, say, the unemployment insurance scheme that the states have. Both have, aligned kind of social automatic stabilizers. In the EU's compound polity, the default has been, and it has been a political default, social reinsurance. I don't think it was designed in that way, but that is what they each time could agree on. And why is that? The new principle is social co-insurance. It requires to be of the same category. The eligibility criteria for when you get unemployment insurance in the state, the member state, must be the same as that of the center, so that you avoid free riding between these schemes. Institutionally aligned, so not only does it have unemployment insurance, but also the same criteria for entitlement and how you finance it and so on. Moral hazard is a big political problem. You always say, and in the United States, it's clear, they shut off their automatic stabilizers each time by these very virtuous balanced budget rules that the parliaments have basically imposed on member state governments. Then leave all the debt making and the bailout and the so to speak stabilization to the center, and later complain about that morass in Washington with all its debt, always raking up big debt. That is even political moral hazard, that you're not taking risks, that you take risks because the downside is shared with everybody else, and perhaps do not make sure that you have employment laws that protect people against being fired immediately, etc., but doing always the politically convenient, and that is fourth state in the United States. So the politics of a federation is often bifurcated. Either you have really communities of risks that are created because the center did a good policy. Canada experienced something like that during the financial crisis, or it's secessionism. You get really unhappy states who want to go out of this close thing. Think of Catalonia during the COVID crisis in Spain. What about, this is just to tell you what reinsurance would be, maybe just to insure these tail risks of two standard deviations to the left, or one, if you're generous, one standard deviation. The good thing here is the convenient thing for a compound polity that has been formed at, as Rokan said, historically inconvenient time when they were fully fledged states, fully fledged nation states, that you can have categorically different forms of reinsurance. The ECB was a reinsurance also for member states that it had to find through these ever more generous asset purchasing programs. In the beginning, it was, of course, only liquidity support to banks, but indirectly that helped, of course, also the fiscal authorities of the member states, that not everything was immediately landing on their lap with a systemically collapsing financial system. Then, of course, fiscal. The RRF is now, or the SURE, the reinsurance called as such, the reinsurance for short-term work or job retention schemes. And then even regulatory, that you have even in a recession, you have to keep your borders open, say for young Southern Europeans who want to find a job elsewhere, even though yourself may be in a recession. But in the EU, it would not be allowed to exclude that. That is a kind of reinsurance position, because the burden, the big burden of the recession falls on the member states. It can be institutionally diverse. You don't have to align the unemployment insurance schemes or the tax systems, etc. Moral hazard is very much deterred because the bulk of the burden of this negative coincidence contingency is borne by the first insurer, the national welfare state, right? And the politics, that is what we don't know much about. And this is actually the research project I want now to do. Is it, because it is solidarity by stealth, most people do not understand what reinsurance is. It's possibly resented because they say, only when we're really on our knees does the EU suddenly come and help us with anything, but not before. Or do they say, oh no, if we're in really bad shape, then the EU, there is a collective that helps us. What it does to this second order loyalty is the question I have. And just to sum up, how did the EU survive a series of severe crises? And not only survive, actually came out stronger than one had expected, with a more robust configuration of these 3Bs. The weaknesses of a compound polity can be temporary strength. I think don't expect that you can pull that off all the time. That would be a misunderstanding, we think. These institutional potentials need to be activated by EU elites through an exceptional mode of politics, and that's this polity maintenance. And last but not least, and perhaps the most interesting point for you, is the EU compound polity is a support system for member states, but we need to think a bit more innovatively, a bit more creatively about how you can create the equivalent of policy capacities and not just say, oh, it needs a central budget because every nation state has a central budget. I think it would break the EU. And that's why I feel very strongly that there is something else, and I'm looking for social reinsurance as that answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Waltraud, for your very interesting insights, also from an economist perspective, into your current research. And I would like, for the general discussion, to ask my colleague Atanas Pekanov for a comment.
No mic, right? I just speak. Do we have mic?
You just sit down.
It's here. Okay, so thank you very much. This was really interesting for me. I think the topics of EU integration are extremely complicated and complex. From a macroeconomic point of view, they are sometimes too simplistic in the sense that, well, in your model, if you only care about stabilization or consumption, you can get one type of results. And if you care a lot about moral hazard and free riding, which you should, you get to other conclusions. But then when you look at the realities, political realities, which Waltraud very well described, but also geopolitical realities, the calculus gets might get very different. So I really like one of the points, which is that, well, all of these crises, they created instruments which created counterfactual, well, they led to counterfactuals that we didn't see. And in my experience, as a practitioner, when I was part of the Bulgarian government and overseeing the RRF for Bulgaria, this is exactly the type of instrument which you create out of, let's say, out of need in a crisis, exactly as other instruments before that, and you don't see what would have happened otherwise. So you don't know the counterfactual. For the RRF, I think my opinion is that it was very. So macroeconomically, it was very efficient. It kept us of not going there where we were in 2012. Mm-hmm. So we didn't have to go through the market stress, to the tax on periphery countries, not only periphery countries, right? Through all of this period of extreme instability on financial markets. So on macro. Long in the making, and receive the funds out of it. So this is how it should be, I think. In other countries, it is, if I understand correctly from what I hear from Spain and Italy, it is, let's say, controversial, maybe. When I look at it, I see the macro numbers, and for Spain and Italy, they are very, very good. They seem very good. So it seems the very, very large sums that Spain and Italy are receiving from the Recovery and Resilience Fund have worked in the sense of boosting, at least in the short term, economic growth and stabilization. There are some very critical comments. Luis Garicano is writing on the Spanish plan that it has a lot of inefficiencies, micro inefficiencies, maybe doesn't help productivity enough as we want. And we know the Italian experience with the super bonus, also a part of the RRF, which is very criticized. So on the micro level, it could be that it's not that efficient, but at the macro level, we see that at least for me, it worked. So from the point of view of my experience in Bulgaria, the interesting part of the RRF is also the performance-based approach. So the idea that now, okay, you receive a lot of funding from the EU, but you only receive it if you deliver on specific reforms. The reforms are mostly the country-specific recommendations that the European semester has prescribed to countries, and they didn't deliver for many, many years. So now finally the EU is trying to push countries to deliver on them. On this, I have, to be honest, mixed feelings on the efficiency. What I mean by that is, well, at least in Bulgaria, but I think in many other countries, a lot of reforms happened because of the RRF. In the case of Bulgaria, we did a reform to introduce control of the general prosecutor. So this was let's say, a legal problem for Bulgaria, a legal challenge that the general prosecutor law was completely absent any control. That meant that the government can install a general prosecutor, and then they could maybe not be very efficient in what they have to do. So because of the RRF, because a lot of money was attached to this, we did the reform that then led to the dropping of the monitoring of the rule of law on Bulgaria. So on that was pretty efficient. But in other areas, I'm not so sure that, let's say, for the amount of money that the EU is giving to member states, you will be able to solve all problems. What I mean by that is, well, the European Commission was, in the case of Bulgaria, extremely insistent, and we had extremely long negotiations that, let's say bluntly, it's a bit more complicated, but let's say that Bulgaria has to close all of its coal power plants. This is an extremely unpopular thing in Bulgaria to do. Nobody wants it. Coal power plants are dirty, that is true. Economically, sometimes they might be beneficial. In most years, they're not beneficial because of the ETS. But in 2022, they gave us a leeway against import of gas. So if you have coal, it's your own sovereign energy source, right? So it is something that exactly in this point of time now that we talk about geopolitical sovereignty and stuff like this, this is actually something that it's very useful to have. So let's say it like this, for 200 or 300 million euro from the EU, I don't think that Bulgaria will close its coal power plants, and it didn't, and it will lose some of the EU money, but I think this is already accepted. So this has important implications, I think, and this is my question to you. How do we use these things that we learn here outside of crisis modes? Because now we're talking about the next EU budget. There are some things to learn from the RRF or the next MFF. One of them is how to use this performance-based approach, so how to distribute EU funds only given specific conditions. I'm not very sure that this will be agreed in the form that the European Commission now envisions. For example, you bind all of the funding, agricultural cohesion, and all the other investment funding with specific reforms that every country has to oblige it will do in the next 5 or 6 years. I think this goes on also in a dangerous direction that would say, well, let's say like this, country-specific recommendations from Brussels are everything you need to do to get your house in order. I'm not very sure this is something that will work. So we'll see how the next budget will embed. And one final thing for the next budget, isn't it? And it is in line with what you said. Doesn't it make sense to embed much more what we would call pan-European public goods? So this is actually something that it makes sense to finance centrally. There, I only see some things that become more and more relevant with each day: defense, infrastructure, research and development, and maybe this is the way to actually form huge acceptance towards a bigger budget, because you deliver on stuff that are cross-border, that are otherwise not going to be delivered at the EU.
Thank you very much. Should I respond immediately, because I've got a bit over time, or would there be questions that also perhaps go along that line?
I think you could start in the first round.
So let me be just very quickly. Can you work these things in peacetime? That's of course this old thinking. Europe will be forged in crisis and will be the sum of the solutions found in this crisis. Monnet's blessing in disguise. I think it's a curse. For this very reason that in crisis, those who need support are in a very bad position. And given the diversity we have, those who are fortunate, let those know who need something and will dictate to some extent what will be done. It was extreme during the Euro era crisis, but in the case of the refugee crisis, it was, funnily enough, the transit and the bystander countries that said to the destination and the frontier states, we don't see that we do burden sharing. Look of how you deal with the situation, right? And we have since then this is a real source of problems. So that's my first response. Don't think that crises are good times for finding all these creative solutions, because really the working out and making them workable is outside of crisis, is in peace times. And more is then going on when the caravan has moved on. And of course, except for Politico and perhaps the FT, nobody reports in detail about what's going on. And I think there's often much more constructive work when it's not in this heat of the media looks at us and every government must come out of these long summits and say, we asserted our position. It is, however, true what you say about the RF, as much as it was a real, I think, a path shifting innovation. The governance later was this old thing of the EU elite bureaucracy actually impressing apparently the national negotiators with the detail they know about their countries. You know, in that sense.
But not always correct details.
I see. I should have interviewed you. We have this from the Italian and the Spaniards, perhaps bigger states with a federal element where, you know, the nationals sometimes don't know all the things that are going on in the countries, and they were impressed. Another sign actually of by knowledge integrated bureaucracies to some extent in the European semester process actually creates this. But at the same time, that they didn't go into, I mean, the numbers of these, what is milestones and targets, and leads exactly to this, not a national bureaucracy thinking about what should be our priorities. What do we have to do in good faith? Instead, we have to do down the tick box, otherwise we don't get the money. And that is really a threat behind it. And therefore it is so damaging what you said with these examples that, you know, Italy gave in that time when the RF was through, gave had a very sensible program of subsidizing, cross-subsidizing renovations that make your house more energy efficient, but 220%, 110%. I mean, seriously, the Germans saw this. And if you didn't want to force a central budget with that kind of headlines, it's dead in the water. And it would divide Europe to the point of I'm 100% sure. Those who force or who always advocate the central budget and fiscal integration like a federation should tell me how you can overcome this democratic hurdle, shall we say, that the national parliaments have to abolish themselves, that national media suddenly must become European-oriented, etc. The pan-European public goods, my colleague Marco Bucci goes round and round with this idea. That's fine, but to me, this can be completely done within the existing structures. The scale is probably now a thing, but before they haven't agreed on how they want to finance this, some tax base that they tax, perhaps a European-wide inheritance tax. Something has to happen there. You cannot forever use the extra space that you have in your budget and do this. So there are big hurdles, but whether the pan-European public goods are the case, yes, cohesion policy is already one of these things that you do. And I'm in favor of it, but don't see it as that solves the question, how do you want to create this fiscal capacity?
Thank you. There's some time left, so let's enter into the general discussion and switch to German, weil jeder des Deutschen mächtig ist.
Ah ja, ja, wir können Deutsch.
Als erstes eine Frage stellen. Bitte.
Ich habe mich gefragt, wie weit diese erfolgreich eingedämmten Krisen, dass es eben existenzielle Krisen waren. Also die Euro-Krise, da war es ja auch Gesprächsthema, dass die Europäische Währungsunion aufbricht oder zerbricht daran. Und es hat dann auch was damit zu tun gehabt, dass dann im Endeffekt Instrumente eingesetzt wurden, die Grenzen des Legalen verschoben haben, würde ich mal sagen.
Ja.
Um es milde auszudrücken, da gibt es auch andere Interpretationen zu dem Thema. Und andere Krisen, wie zum Beispiel die Migrationskrise, die sind nicht so existenziell. Und die haben dann auch nicht die Werkzeuge hervorgebracht, die man sich wünschen würde auf europäischer Seite. Und vielleicht auch die Covid-19-Krise in dem Augenblick, wo sie zugeschlagen hat, so etwas wie ein existenzieller Stress. Mit den Bildern aus Bergamo waren wir, glaube ich, alle sehr entsetzt und hatten Angst. Da gab es dann auch die Lösungsvorschläge von Seiten der Kommission, die dann mehr oder weniger sinnvoll etwas bewegt haben oder nicht. Also meine Frage ist, wie weit hängt das alles dran, dass es existenzbedrohende Szenarien waren, die sich da aufgetan haben? Das ist meine erste Frage. Und ist man dann in der Existenzbedrohung, in dieser Situation, willens, die bestehenden Regeln zu dehnen? Ja. Und sonst passiert es eben gar nicht.
Ja, also da kann man sagen, existenzielle Krisen sind auch immer Krisen, wo man merkt, wie konnte das passieren? Jetzt die Pandemie die Pandemie war etwas, das stößt einem zu und das ist ein Großteil der Welt zugestoßen. Aber die Euro-Krise und diese ganze zu wenig Supervision für die Finanzinnovation, was wir jetzt wieder haben mit AI und wie das finanziell alles gemacht wird und so weiter, da kann man ja sagen, die monetäre Integration selber, die immer auch eine finanzielle Integration ist, war mit eine Ursache, dass das dann zu dieser Eskalation führt. Und dann kann man sagen, ja, wenn es dann existenziell ist, ohne dich wirklich zu brechen, dann ist das vielleicht ideal, um diese Grenzen zu verschieben, die vorher sozusagen nicht verschiebbar waren. Also Lending of Last Resort durch die Zentralbank, ein Bailout-Fund, wo man sagte, irgendwas muss helfen, wenn ein Mitgliedsland in die Krise kommt. Das ist eine mögliche Weise, das funktional zu erklären. Unsere Erklärung ist eher, dass man sagt, die Krisen, die nicht gut gelöst werden, das ist die Rule of Law Krise und die Refugee-Krise, die Flüchtlingskrise, wo man von der letzteren ja sagen muss, das ist ein wohlbekanntes, hartes Policy-Problem, aber wirklich nichts Neues. Darauf kann man vorbereitet sein. Wir hatten es seit den Ex-Jugoslaw-Kriegen und so, dass es diese Riesenströme gibt. Es sind aber auch Krisen über Identität. Also wenn man sagt, man hat sozusagen so ein Triangle, wo unten die Grenzen, Boundaries, oben die Binding Authority und die Bonds hier stehen, dann ist die Kombination von Boundaries und Authority, das sind Souveränitätskonflikte, die zwischen Autorität und Bonding, das sind Solidaritätskonflikte und dann und das ist auch der Grund, warum Scholars wie Wokan dachten, die EU kann nichts werden, nicht viel werden, weil es diese Bindung zwischen harten Grenzen und Community Formation gibt. Das sind Identitätskonflikte. Und das Problem, wir haben die Dynamik von Krisenpolitiken angeschaut, wie die sozusagen starten an einer Ecke und wie man dann versuchen kann, als EU, das zu Souveränitäts- oder Solidaritätskonflikten zu kommen, wo sie immer irgendwelche Kompromisse findet. Bei Identitätskonflikten nicht. Und das ist die populistische Challenge. Da steht die EU in Bezug auf die möglichen Lösungen so sehr für eine Seite, Offenheit, Kosmopolitismus, liberale Ordnung. Und die anderen sagen, nein, geschlossene Grenzen. Wir wollen nationale Grenzen, nationale Community. Und da kann sie sozusagen keine Lösungen finden. Es ist also nicht so sehr, dass sie nicht Instrumente hätte. Sie will sie nicht finden, weil das gegen die ganze, wofür sie steht und stehen muss, dass man keine Diskriminierung aufgrund der Nationalität hat. Also dieser neue Cleavage, von denen Akademiker, Soziologen und so weiter sprechen, ist eben, dass es die Grenze, die Cleavage gibt, die tiefe Spaltung, um die sich das politische System immer mehr orientiert, nicht mehr rechts-links nur, sondern auch Offenheit versus Geschlossenheit. Und dass wir das Problem eher da sehen, weniger als Existenzialität als solche, obwohl ich dafür offen wäre, weil am Ende muss man Politiklösungen finden. Und wie Sie sagen, man hat es dann immer gefunden, weil einem das Wasser bis zum Hals stand. Und erst dann konnte man sich bewegen. Ja.
Was anderes. Vielleicht ist ein Projekt, das tatsächlich sehr starke Eigenschaften eines öffentlichen Gutes hat, ein guter Aufhänger für eine europäische Lösung. Also ich denke da zum Beispiel an Verteidigung. Verteidigung. Landesverteidigung. Das macht ich bin kein Militärstratege, aber es macht eigentlich aus der Sicht eines kleinen Landes heutzutage eigentlich keinen Sinn mehr, eine eigenständige Armee mit eigenständiger Luftabwehr zu betreiben. Also man sieht, dass selbst ein Land wie Israel, das bis an die Zähne bewaffnet ist und eine stehende Miliz hat, im Prinzip die Unterstützung Amerikas braucht, um tatsächlich strategisch bestehen zu können und auch taktisch bestehen zu können.
Ja.
Und da geht es von der Informationsaustausch über Luftabwehr und alles Mögliche. Schafft ein Land in der Größe Israels nicht, das sehr, sehr viel in diesen Bereich investiert, auch sehr starke Industrien hat in dem Bereich. Ich würde da sagen, die europäischen kleinen Staaten schaffen das schon gar nicht. Und selbst die großen wie Frankreich, Italien und Deutschland sind nicht in der Lage, das derzeit auf die Beine zu stellen.
Ja.
Und da frage ich mich, ob so ein Projekt, wo wirklich öffentliches Gut so offensichtlich dasteht, ob das nicht ein Bereich ist, wo man gemeinsame Ressourcen dann bindet und auch gemeinsam einsetzen kann, weil ja auch hier in dem Fall etwas zu Hilfe kommen kann, das wir woanders nicht so stark haben. Da gibt es eine externe Institution in Form der NATO, die sowieso schon einen Großteil der nationalen Verteidigungsbestrebungen koordiniert oder zumindest eine Plattform dafür bereitstellt. Und ja, glauben Sie, dass das ein Projekt ist, das funktionieren könnte? Außerhalb der Krise jetzt,
ja,
nur unter Bedrohung.
Richtig. Da kann man nicht da kann ich nicht für alle sprechen, weil ich sehr stark 2022 gesagt habe, wir machen nicht die Ukraine-Krise. Hans-Peter Krise sagte, wir können die nicht weglassen. Wir hatten keinerlei Foreign Policy, Security Spezialistin in unserem Projekt. Also mir schien, das ist Ambulance Chasing. Ich würde inzwischen, wie wir wiederholt die Diskussion hatten und auch für dieses Buch, müssen wir das nicht rein. Also jeder wird erwarten. Meine Position ist, unsere Theorie sagt uns genau, warum sich die EU damit unendlich schwer tun wird. Wenn man Leute in den Krieg schickt, kann man nicht Dispersed Authority haben. Dann braucht man konzentrierte, klare Autoritätsstrukturen. Man verteidigt dann harte Grenzen. Und die Loyalität muss ziemlich hoch sein, weil sie schicken Leute in den Tod. Ich würde also deshalb sagen, im Prinzip, wir haben nie gesehen, dass es NATO brauchte, um diese politische Form der EU zu realisieren. Und ich sehe im Moment, die EU mag eine Föderation werden, aus den Gründen, die Sie gerade, das sind alles gute Gründe und die EU ist mal entstanden, weil der Nationalstaat eigentlich nicht das Grundlegende eines jeden Staates sichern konnte, das Leben und sein Territorium verteidigen konnte. Also wäre es schon eine Aufgabe. Aber so wie es geworden ist, mit der NATO, das sozusagen delegiert mit Amerika im wesentlichen Boot, würde eine grundsätzliche Änderung dieser politischen Form verlangen. Und wir können fast sagen, dass wir NATO hatten, hat es erlaubt, eine neue politische Form zu erfinden. Wenn man in der Nachkriegszeit dachte, der Nationalstaat ist als solches erledigt. Zweimal im 20. Jahrhundert hat er nicht geschafft, das zu tun, was man von ihm erwartet. Und tatsächlich wurde es der Rescue of the Nation State, wie Alan Milward berühmterweise sagte. Aber ich bin sehr skeptisch, dass die EU diesen Switch machen kann, ohne sich völlig transformieren zu müssen. Und er muss schauen, dass sie die NATO erhält, so schwierig das im Moment aussieht. Und da bin ich nicht genug Expertin, um mehr dazu zu sagen. Sorry.
Wir sind im Prinzip am Ende der Zeit. Online gibt es auch keine Fragen. Wenn es sonst keine Fragen mehr gibt, dann vielen Dank für den wirklich sehr spannenden Kommentar.